Cultic is in ways an extensive exploration of a game that existed before it, and in the same effort the creator takes to making the best shooter possible, it also goes beyond its sources of inspiration. From the moment I played the demo when it first dropped, I could immediately feel that source and at the same time recognize a game that is damn near perfect. As I've said before in the past, a lot of retro shooters that I've played, I've enjoyed immensely. But there's only been a select few that give me a lasting impression, something that truly felt special for a multitude of reasons. We all have those perfect games that hit all of the right buttons for us, and as we allow more experiences to come into our lives, especially in gaming, it takes more effort to impress us. But that's not to say that there aren't enough good games, mind you, it's just that in life you get to a stage where you've seen a great deal of what a genre can offer, and your sense of quality becomes more demanding over time. This was especially the case in the earlier period of the FPS genre. Cultic is a game that echoes the past and brings it into the future with everything that it accomplishes, and it was all done by one person. Which is really all it takes nowadays. With the right amount of talent, effort, discipline, and dedication, games like this can be made. But games like this are rare, because the developer had realized that he had something special, a unique spark that only needed time to implement the desired canvas, the setting to match, and the fusion of build engine inspired gameplay but with modernized mechanics behind it, creating a harmony of retro graphics and modern controls, which is where we are now in the stage of retro shooters. Since Doom 2016, we've had a surge of these type of games stemming from Doom 2016's success, with other games like Devil Daggers, Dusk, Ultra Kill, Medieval, Proteus, and so many others following suit, with many more in between. Today though, we have more Doom and Quake-like games than we could ever have hoped for, and only now games like Fear and Half-Life are getting their own spiritual successors. Two examples to illustrate this case would be Trepang 2 and Kvark, one being a modernized take of Fear's Gunfu inspired gameplay, and Kvark taking inspiration from games like Half-Life and Stalker, blending their atmosphere and gameplay into a beautiful lo-fi blend. In the case of Cultic though, and there's no avoiding this, it takes a lot of pages from Blood, a game that I covered not too long ago, about it being the best build engine game ever made with a unique setting and a character that is unique in his own right, alongside addicting gunplay. When Cultic was first announced and with the demo being released, people couldn't help but make the same parallels between this game and Blood, with the presence of the cultist-like enemies, the older weapons, as well as the use of dynamite. It seemed blatantly obvious that it was inspired by Blood. In a way, it does feel like the sequel to Blood we never had. But after my experience and exploration of the game, I personally feel it deserves more praise than to just simply classify it as a spiritual successor to Blood, because it does so much more in the gameplay, story, and art department, especially when you look at the game's graphics and art presentation as you explore it. Cultic is a game solely made by Jason Smith, who did the art, the code, the music, and just about everything else that you see in this game. That means he implemented all of the game's unique mechanics, written the story, arranged the sound effects and the music, created all of the sprite work made for the weapons, the enemies, the 3D models in the environments and the levels, including the voxels that comprise of things like the cars, the trucks, the corpses, the notebooks, the lanterns, barrels, even the typewriter to nudge in some inspiration from Resident Evil 4. Making a game this polished is hard, even for a small team or a team the size of id Software or Rockstar. It takes a considerable amount of time. Time, I emphasize, because that is the single hardest aspect of game development, one that is overlooked by so many. So not coding, not art or writing, but time. It is the reason why so many people get burnt out through the process. It is also the reason why game development is still difficult even today to get into, despite all of the resources and engines available. Jason Smith took all of the time needed to make one of the best shooters ever made, maybe even almost the best retro-inspired shooter today, all by himself. There have been a few miracle stories like this over the years, one in particular, Stardew Valley, made by another solo developer, Concerned Ape, also known as Eric Barron, who also had gone through the painstaking effort to learn everything necessary to make his dream game, a game that harkens back to the days of Harvest Moon, a series inspired by agriculture and country life, with Stardew Valley being something similar to that and more, and something that is still loved and obsessed over to this very day. Cultic is also a game that has the same phenomenon, touched by that same spark, where the passion is involved, orchestrated by the mind of one person that can make something truly amazing, which is also Cultic. Its attention to detail in its own setting, the finely tuned array of weapons and the beautiful sprite work of the monsters and its clever implementation of dithering in the pixel department, the oily color palette being coated over its atmosphere. This is a game that never wavers on what it wants to be and goes beyond what its biggest sources of inspiration tried to do, by giving you more freedom and utility in the sandbox that you find yourself in terms of the gameplay and exploration. Usually with retro shooters like their predecessors, it goes light on the story so that it doesn't get too much in the way of the frantic action, and to a degree, this game is also guilty of that same approach, except that it gives you a lot more story to work with in both the beginning and the many notes that you can find at either the typewriters or the notebooks you come across. Mind you too that with the typewriters you can also mash buttons, and you can see the result as you read the note, which I thought was a really cool detail. The game's story starts you off with you, the character, investigating the doings of a cult, with missing people involved and reports of disturbing rituals leading to outcomes unknown, at least before you arrive anyway. Before you know it, you're killed and find yourself awakening amongst a pile of corpses. Now that the gloves are off, metaphorically speaking, you go on a rampage all the way to the heart of their stronghold. Some of the notes show a private investigator infiltrating the cult and what they're up to. Other notes talk of other cult members or other people inhabiting the same town. Your situation only becomes more apparent when you start seeing the stranger creatures born out of ravenous nightmares, a sighting in the sky showing an unknown effect taking place, among other things as well. The notes are just pieces to a bigger puzzle, one that is technically incomplete in this game anyway due to the fact that Cultic, as it is now, is only in its first chapter. The core game is complete, but future chapters will be sold later as paid DLC, which I'm okay with because if it's anything of this chapter's caliber, then I'm beyond stoked for it. What this game and Blood definitely have in common though is the thematic aspect, that is in the setting itself. But Cultic is fundamentally different in one thing, its character. Cultic has no personality in the same sense that Blood does with Caleb. Our main character in Cultic doesn't really give access to his thoughts or feelings on the situation or his circumstance, and I think it's something that should be explored more in future chapters. In Blood, we get a number of quotes and a few scenes that tell and show us what Caleb really is. A sadistic killer with some catchy lines and morbid humor, who is really no better than the dark god Chernobog that he's fighting against. It may be early to come to a complete conclusion in the sense of Cultic's character, but it's a case that should be presented nonetheless and explored further. However, the gameplay, the art, and the atmosphere of Cultic is beyond incredible. I generally like darker themed settings, ranging from games like Dark Souls or Stalker, or even games like Fear and Hunger and its Berserk-inspired setting. Cultic goes with Blood's 20th century-inspired theme and explores it further, but through its deeper gameplay mechanics and sense of movement and freedom and exploration, as well as the utility that you have available in explosives, such as the oil lanterns, the barrels, TNT, Molotovs, you name it. Cultic can be as fast-paced or as slow-paced as you wish, which boils down to skill levels and enemy awareness because yes, like Blood, there are also hit-scan enemies. However, unlike Blood, enemies are more telegraphed in comparison. You often hear the loading of a weapon no matter which one, which signals a warning to take cover or risk getting shot. Blood's cultist enemies are like gunslingers on steroids during a duel, shooting you before you can even blink, a symptom of the build engine's use of enemy AI. Don't get me wrong though, Cultic can still put up a hell of a fight, especially on very hard or extreme, where it expects you to be more than familiar with the core gameplay. The roster here behaves in a way where they're just as dangerous to each other as they are to you. Like the demons in Doom, they're chaotic by nature, which means if you manipulate them in the correct manner, you can get them to infight each other, which leads to some great opportunities for some dynamite treatment. Ah yes, the dynamite. It was the most useful weapon in Blood, arguably, and in Cultic, the same is true to an extent. to an extent. But because of the effectiveness of the other weapons that you have available to you, like the FG-42 sniper rifle, the leather action rifle, the shotgun, the grenade launcher, and even the pistol and the machine gun, it's no longer your only lifesaver. In fact, you have not just the Molotov cocktail to use, like I said, but barrels and oil lanterns to create a fire hazard for the enemies, as well as setting up traps. There are some sections in the game where large groups of enemies gather in a dense room, but it's not as prominent like it was in Blood. It is of course still worth using, and even has other ways of using it, like doing a quick throw, only for you to just shoot it, which requires a lot of precision, or kicking it towards the enemy, which, mind you, they can do the exact same thing, which is an awesome detail in the gameplay department due to the physics implemented. All of the weapons in this game don't feel out of place, have great secondary attack potential, and even upgrade options to make them more useful, which you obtain by finding weapon parts. If you're a completionist, you will be able to find the necessary upgrades to maximize the effectiveness for each weapon that you collect. Oh yeah, of course, the flamethrower. How could I forget this beautiful creation where fire is like a superpower in this game? It can cook just about anything, even the stronger enemies that you face later on. Which leads to a point I made in Blood about being smart in the way you approach enemies. Cultic is quite challenging, and on the higher difficulties it can be really unforgiving. But once you identify the most efficient way of dealing with individual enemies, as well as using the right weapon, it all boils down to playing smarter, rather than being a lunatic jumping and diving everywhere. Cultic is polished to a T in the gameplay department. There's never a delay in feeling or a period of jankiness whatsoever. You can see it in the animations or the mechanics of the player movement, like jumping, running, and diving. They all feel natural and don't break the flow that this game provides. And of course, you can play it a lot slower, setting up traps for your foes and utilizing cover. And that's just one way of going through the game. And it doesn't necessarily chastise you for having your own preferences in playstyle. For me, I hate stealth. I absolutely hate it. I go right into the action unapologetically. Either way though, there are unique challenges involved with either approach, so there's really no right or wrong. It just boils down to things like resource allocation, enemy awareness, as well as understanding your skill level. Things like that will be more important in the later difficulties. Resources are also either plentiful or scarce, depending on the difficulty, of course. Health is something precious in very hard or extreme, because of how rare it can be. But when you take into account of how much damage you can only take, it is better to think more about positioning and enemy awareness, not allowing yourself to be caught off guard and realizing that health doesn't matter as much because you're gonna die quickly anyways, so survival instinct is more of a priority here. On lower difficulties, things are more lenient, where you can get away with mistakes and go wild with the carnage. Cultic has the right amount of challenge and the gameplay to support it in a setting that hasn't even reached its full potential yet, which also depends on what the future chapters do with Cultic's world. Graphically, the game does an amazing job with embracing its palette and getting the most use out of it, by gearing it towards uncanny and interesting designs seen in the monsters, as well as the sprite work done on the weapons too. They look and feel immensely satisfying to use. And what we have are only the 20th century side of weapons here. I would love to see something like the Voodoo Doll or the Life Leech from Blood be in Cultic, where we have more artifact-based weapons, reflective of the cult and the entity that they worship. In terms of the game's colour, it can appear somewhat dull, where players may expect a more dynamic array of colours, but when it comes down to games with a more darker tone, the darker colour palettes are generally more suited to the experience. Everything is meant to have a more deathly atmosphere surrounding it, given the fact that you're in a town devoid of friendlies, people that you could just sit down and talk to without the worry of a hatchet or a bundle of dynamite being thrown at you. The warehouses, the factories, the dungeons, the mines, and eventually the asylum and the sanctum that you go through suit the oily dark colours here, and I honestly wouldn't have it any other way. Not all games need to have rainbows, but all games need to know what it wants to be before it ever gets released. In the case of Cultic, it's a dark world, only made darker by the forces that you're only just beginning to discover, with future chapters going along with it. With the current chapter available, you have a good chunk of content to enjoy, and they all have their own unique moments going along with it. My favourites in particular being the moment where you go into the mines where everything goes quiet. You see lines of bodies and roaming figures trapped in body bags or something. But the moment you pick up the key, a laugh is heard and this happens. A guy with a chainsaw comes running at you and you do everything you can to either kill it or to get the fuck away from it. But don't worry, you'll be fighting more of them later on, so have fun with that. Then there's the asylum level, where it's more paranormal in its presentation than anything. From moving objects to floating entities that can move objects without touching them towards you or just choking you to death by, staring at them. Only for the whole thing to escalate further to blood and bullets once all the other enemies appear. Cultic has some amazing horror moments laced throughout its experience, which is where its other sources of inspiration like Resident Evil come in. Some of the monsters are really creepy with their designs, and the developer's understanding of suspense and tension is really well done in this game. The music is also a highlight, having some intense but engaging tracks in the thick of the action, and dead silence when you least expect it, with some ambience in between. In horror, music and sound is just as important, because sound is usually the first thing we respond to in the anticipation of danger, and music can influence the mood and feeling involved in it. Cultic does a great job of doing both, and it's one of the harder things to do in a horror game, let alone a shooter in general. In terms of hours, you're looking at anywhere from 5 hours to upwards, which is an average length for most retro-inspired shooters. But if you end up fatigued with the campaign side of it, then the survival mode is also an option that's also quite fun, having 4 different maps to play in with rankings and leaderboards to aim for, separated by their difficulty as well. And in the survival mode, you have access to upgrading the weapons selected. The only thing you have to do here is, get a good score and play at your best until you finally drop, such is the way for endless modes. Cultic is undoubtedly a miracle game, born from the brain of one developer who used blood as a bedrock for something with far more potential, as evidenced by its incredibly polished gameplay, its beautiful blend of 3D models, 2D and voxel sprites, its blend of 20th century backdrops filled with cultists in robes followed by nightmarish creatures, to its environmental opportunities for more dynamic combat in the oil lanterns, the barrels, and the traps that you could set up for the enemies. There is a unique level of passion and polish that Cultic has in spades, that isn't often found in a lot of games made by dozens of people within a team. If you want undeniable proof that you can make a masterpiece of a game by yourself, then look to games like this and Stardew Valley to give yourself reassurance. It's currently the highest rated FPS game on Steam, and it rightly deserves it, because it provides fun gameplay with freedom in both combat and movement, and some fantastic detail involved in both the action and the horror. I've held recent retro shooters like Dusk, Ultra Kill, Harrot, and Slayers X in high regard, and now Cultic joins the other 4 in what I personally feel are the best retro-inspired shooters available today. But that's just my opinion anyways. Go and buy Cultic, it's a no-brainer if you're into games like Doom or Blood. Thank you for watching,